started the research program that I'm now going to report to you. What I did, I am a neuropsychologist rather than a neurophysiologist. And so I was more interested in the cortex than the brainstem. And this was in the mid-1980s. And we knew that the cortex does something rather more complicated than synthesize. You know, this idea that the cortex is activated randomly during REM sleep, and what it does is join the dots. That's reasonable enough, but the different parts of the cortex contain different kinds of dots and do slightly more finessed operations than synthesize. So I predicted that, for example, if you have damage in the visual cortex, then the visual content of your dreams will be distorted or perhaps obliterated. That if you have damage in language cortex, that you won't be able to speak in your dreams, just as you can't speak in waking life, and so on. These are sort of fairly obvious predictions. So I wasn't questioning Hobson's theory. We all knew that the problem of where and how dreams are generated, the causal mechanism of dreams was in the brainstem. It was the same thing as the mechanism of REM sleep. But I was interested in the contents, in what does the cortex actually do that unpacks this not synthesis. What I found was really mostly, well, not mostly, it was entirely, in fact, serendipitous. The only one of my predictions that I think is theoretically interesting that was confirmed, I predicted that the prefrontal cortex, which I'm indicating on the screen now, this area here, which is our evolutionary pride and joy, us human beings, we got lots of prefrontal cortex. It's responsible for, it's equivalent to this pre-conscious part of the mind that Freud spoke about, the sort of verbally mediated, logical, rational, goal-directed agency, the sort of head office of the mind. I hypothesized, since during dreams, we don't seem to be in charge of our mental processes. They don't seem particularly rational and goal-directed. We are kind of passive recipients of what happens to us during dreams. I predicted that damage to this part of the brain would have no effect on dreams. And I was right about that. If you take the dreams, these patients with severe damage to the prefrontal cortex, they are very impaired in their waking cognition, but their dreams are indistinguishable from yours and mine. Blind raters cannot find any difference. They cannot differentiate the dreams of patients with damage to the prefrontal cortex and the dreams of you and me, assuming that you, like me, do not have prefrontal cortical damage. Here's a sort of summary of what I found. What I've just told you about was this part here, this dark blue area on this diagram is the prefrontal cortex here. As I said, damage there has no effect on the content of dreams. Now I'll tell you about some, I'm not going to tell you about everything I found, we don't have time. I'll tell you about the two most interesting things. And these were, as I said a moment ago, entirely unexpected chance discoveries, just good fortune. Patients with damage here, which is the mesoportum tegmentum, in other words, patients with damage here, although they lost REM sleep, and in fact we knew before my study that human beings with damage there, like cats and rats, REM sleep is obliterated with damage there. I was not studying rats and cats, I was studying human beings, so I could talk to them. And of course, I didn't produce the damage in my research participants. I had to wait for naturally occurring lesions. I studied a large group, roughly 350 patients, so it took me several years to collect this data. I had 18 patients here, all of whom, like previous research had shown, these patients do not have REM sleep, and yet my patients reported dreams, because I was using subjective methods, in other words, talking to people about their experience, I was absolutely shocked to find all these years after the discovery of REM sleep and its correlation with dreaming in the mid-1950s. This correlation was, taken, the fact that REM sleep and dreams occur together at the same time, this correlation was taken to be an identity. It was taken to mean that dreams and REM sleep are the same thing. As I said to you earlier, REM sleep was taken to be the objective manifestation of the subjective process called dreams. And we then dropped the dreams like slippery fish because they're an embarrassment to science. You don't want to study this fluffy subjective stuff. So we then shifted to just studying the objective brain processes in order to get a proper scientific grip on what are the causal mechanisms of dreams. And so to my amazement, when I discovered that my 18 patients that I actually spoke to and gathered subjective reports from, reported, all of them, that they were still dreaming, I went back to the literature over the last 40 years and found that nobody had ever done that. Nobody had ever, although we knew that human beings, like other mammals, when they have damage here, their sleep stops. Nobody had bothered to ask them, are you dreaming? And I really think it's for the reason that I've been saying periodically during my talk so far. It's because subjective data, we have an aversion to it in science. But it leads us to wrong-headed conclusions to leave out the subjective data, because the fact that dreams and REM sleep correlate does not mean that they're identical. We teach undergraduate students this. Correlation is not causation and all that. So by leaving subjective data out, we can make some dreadful mistakes. It seemed as if REM sleep and dreaming were not the same thing, because damage here leads to a loss of REM sleep with preservation of dreaming. Strengthening this conclusion was the fact that patients with damage to posterior cortex, patients with damage here, these patients had the opposite phenomenology. They had continuation of preservation of REM sleep, but loss of dreams. So with damage in the brain stem, you have loss of REM sleep with preservation of dreams. With damage in this cortical region here, you have loss of dreams with preservation of REM sleep. This is called a double dissociation of function. It showed that they cannot be the same thing. Dreams and REM sleep are two different things. Now, this part of the brain is responsible for, in fact, if any part of the cortex performs the function that Hobson called synthesis, then it's this area, because this is called the inferior parietal lobule. It is where somatosensory information and auditory information and visual information converge. So if you're going to generate a multimodal mental image or hallucination, such as we do in dreams, then no region would be more likely to perform that synthetic function, that bringing together of all of our different perceptual modalities into an experience than this part of the brain. So that wasn't a surprise. What was a surprise, and this is the last of my findings I'm going to mention to you, was that damage in this area had the same consequence. The area that I've marked red. This is the white matter, the white, not the cortex, the white matter, the fibers under the cortex in this part of the brain here, which is called the meso, sort of like the ventromesial quadrant of the frontal lobes, the bottom middle part of the frontal lobes. And unlike this area here, which made good sense that damage here, if you can't generate a mental image, how are you going to generate a dream? The same thing could not be said of this region. It was not by any means clear why damage there should lead to a loss of dreaming.